Hey, everybody, it's Scott Lecky back from Democracy Tomorrow. Today, we're talking about the election results in the Netherlands. The results are still not clear. The election was yesterday. And we have with us today a special guest from Holland, from a town near to the fourth biggest city in Holland, Utrecht, where I lived many years myself, Hoop van der Wouden. And he's going to bring us up to date on where things stand now about who's going to govern the very democratically inclined Dutch population over the next period of time. What are the possible coalition scenarios? Which parties actually participated in this election, and where Holland goes from here? So, Hoop, welcome to Democracy Tomorrow. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Scott. Glad to
So,
be here.
tell us about the elections. Are you clear yet in Holland about who's going to run the country after all these years of instability, or is it still up in the air?
It's up in the air. The vote has been clear, but what's going to happen next is indeed up in the air. So, but maybe I should first tell you where we're coming from, because these were definitely the most exciting elections in years. And why? Because no party really got the majority of the votes. Usually the case is that one party is clearly the biggest. They will start negotiations over a new coalition. As you know, we have a parliamentary democracy, so there's not one side ruling. It's always a combination of parties together, called a coalition, that need to govern the country. So we are coming from a situation where we had a very new, inexperienced government consisting of a whole bunch of new parties that came into existence because of a deeply felt resentment and disappointment over the ruling parties. Now, those parties in the last year and a half formed a government which was complete and utter chaos. It was really very bad, very inexperienced ministers, secretaries, continuous fighting, protesting. It was very strange. And at some point in time, the biggest party stepped out of the coalition, basically blew up the government. There was PVV, which of course then forced new elections, because we were only 1 year into the typical 4-year period of government. So PVV stepped out. PVV is the very much anti-immigration. That's basically their only real issue. And they stepped out, and the people basically punished them for that. So the parties that made up the government in the last year all lost. Even the VVD, which is one of the only one of the real traditional parties, they still lost 1 seat in the predicted results. But PVV lost big. There was a farmers lobbying party called BBB. They lost. There was a very interesting party called NSC, which supposedly would bring back decent, responsible government. They had 20 seats, so there was a significant amount, and they ended up with 0. So, and this was all, of course, in the polls. So the last 2 weeks we spent in front of the TV watching a multitude of debates. There were, I think, 10 or maybe even 15 public debates where everybody got on stage and started arguing over things and having personal attacks and everything. Analyses, commentary. It was very exciting. No clear winner, which was, of course, very interesting. So we had 4 parties that were, 5 parties that were almost equal in the polls. And they were, to introduce the main players here, the PVV, the old anti-immigration party.
Which stands for Party for the Freedom, basically. The
Yes.
Freedom Party.
Yes, many anti-immigration and extreme right-wing parties to which they belong claim the word freedom, which is always interesting. We'll
indeed.
do another podcast on that. But they came from 37 seats, and they now have 26. So that's one. Then we have traditional right-wing party VVD, part of the coalition as well. And
Party for the Freedom and Democracy.
Another one. They're traditional liberals in the Dutch sense of the word. So VVD, traditional right-wing party, they lost 1 seat. So they did fairly well in spite of the abysmal performance in the last year. Then we have, of course, PvdA GroenLinks. They're a
Labor Party, Green Left.
combination of Labour and Green Left. They disappointed. They merged in the last year with the intention, of course, to be more appealing to left-leaning audiences, but no one bought their story. Very interesting. Also another podcast, but they went from 25 to 20, which is very strange given that the government was so unpopular and they were in the opposition. So that's that. Then we had two parties that were sort of devastated, completely destroyed in the last elections. D66, slightly left-leaning Democratic Party, and CDA, slightly right-leaning Christian Democrats, very close to center. And the people voted for them. And D66 went from, I believe, 6 seats to 26, round and about. Enormous. And they had a very positive campaign, sort of a yes we can type campaign. CDA was destroyed by the party that got destroyed this election, and they went again from, I think, from 8 to 18. So it's very interesting that the traditional big parties are there again. All the splinter parties pretty much all but got destroyed, and we're now in a phase where the parties will start talking to each other.
There's also the Ja 21 Party, which is worth
Yeah.
mentioning. Brand new.
Yeah, it's definitely Ja 21 is started, of course, in 21.
Stands for correct answer. Correct
Well,
answer 21.
Ja means yes, but it also happens to be the
Juist
initials of
antwoord.
the founders of the parties.
But it's
Yeah.
officially called Juiste antwoord, right? Isn't it?
Well, no, that's one. It's Joost and Annabelle. That's the two founders.
Seriously?
Yes.
That's hilarious.
So it's unclear. They will undoubtedly claim that it's not Joost and Annabelle, but who knows?
Right,
So
right.
they're
And they're
definitely
extreme right also, right?
they're the extreme right, and they got bigger basically by eating away votes from the PVV,
Right.
who
Right.
really showed to the nation that they were not government material, if you will. They basically spent all their time in government protesting against all sorts of things that were wrong instead of actually fixing them, because that's what, of course, the public who voted for them asked them to do, but didn't happen.
Yeah, right. And then there's a whole series of smaller parties as well. You have Socialist Party who ended up with
I think
3
we have
seats.
we had 27 parties
Yeah.
on the ballot, and a whole bunch of them are complete and utter splinters. And then there's a bunch of small ones. Volt, which is a pro-European party, got 1 seat. 50 plus, that's sort of a party representing
citizens.
the retirement community. They got two the Party for the Animal Rights. They got 3 seats. They're of course left leading, and then there's a couple of religious parties, a couple of pro-immigration parties, a whole bunch of them, and they're all smaller than 4 seats each.
So a grand total of about 12 parties made it into parliament or so, right?
Let's see.
Something like that.
Let's see. No, we got more. I would say between 15 and 20 still. There's a lot of small ones. A lot of small ones.
So you need essentially to get 0.67% of the vote nationally in order
We
to
have
get 1 seat.
150 seats in parliament, divided by 100%. That leaves you 0.67.
1%.
What usually happens is that they do plain counting, and every 0.67% counts for 1 seat. But after everything is counted, there are still some percentages that do not add up to a full seat. And then there's a whole redistribution mechanism that could decide who gets the remaining. Well, usually it's about 4 or 5 seats, something. And they get redistributed over the parties.
Yeah, that's very similar to the Australian Senate way of voting. And so, I mean, so in terms of, as of now, a day or two after, depending on what time zone you're in, the election, still totally unclear who's going to govern.
Yeah, there's a couple of things clear. And it all depends on the way government is formed. To be able to govern, you really need a majority of the seats in parliament. If you do not have that, which is called a minority government, you basically are depending for every single decision on the smaller parties, which means that they want something for their vote. That means that you have to give them something. Becomes very complicated. So the rule is you really want a majority in parliament. Now, there's two ways to get that. Number one, the parties that are absolutely needed for a government are D66, the big winner, CDA, the centrum right winner, and VVD, the mainstay on the right side. And those three add up to approximately just under 75, just under half of the seats.
And then you
Now,
need 76 for a majority, of course.
you need 76 for a majority. Now, no party wants to be put in a government together with PVV. The two winners, D66 and CDA, have both said we completely ruled it out. It's not going to happen. They had their chance. They blew it. We don't want to be associated with them. Not going to happen. So we have these three parties adding up to 70 something, and they need a fourth to be able to get a majority. Now, there are two candidates for that fourth party. Number one is Ja 21, a right wing, extreme right party, which would definitely lead to a strongly right leaning government. And this is what VVD wants, but this is not at all what D66 wants, because they have run a very positive change is coming campaign, appealing to the young. The last thing they want to do is go into government with their right party. So that's number one. So this is a candidate from D66 perspective, not very likely. The other candidate is a slightly left/center government. D66, CDA, VVD are there, and then you add the Labour Green Left Party to it. Now, this leads to an extremely stable majority of, I believe, 86 or 87 seats. And this is 90% of the political landscape in the Netherlands in the last 50 years. Every single government has consisted of these parties in some combination. So that would be a piece of cake, complete no-brainer, do it. However, VVD, basically most strongly voiced by their leader, Dylan Jessugus, have said time and time again, we are not going to be in a government together with PvdA. And why that is not entirely clear, but it looks like she has an extremely large dislike of the PvdA leader, which is Frans Timmermans. Very senior politician, been around in the Netherlands and Europe for years. However, due to the disappointing results of his party, he stepped down yesterday, 5 minutes after the results came in. He got on stage and said, I have failed you all. I could not convince the voters to vote Green Left PvdA, so I'm stepping down. So that means that one potential obstacle is removed. Now, VVD, again, strongly voiced a no-go for a left-leaning government. However, this is what D has said time and time again in the last couple of weeks. This is what we really would like to be, because that's most what we are. And I did a little comparison with respect to the actual votes being brought out in Parliament in the last year between those four candidate parties. And it showed that D66 and Green Left PvdA agreed in more than 80% of the votes. So in the actual voting in Parliament, they are very close. And the gap between D66 and VVD Ja 21 on the other side is far bigger. They only agreed on maybe 50%. So it's obvious that from D66 perspective, to go right is not very interesting to them, because they will be in complete disagreement for about half the time, which will make it very difficult to push their agenda. And they're very likely, in my personal opinion, that they're going to get punished for that after 4 years or however long the next government will last. So it's up in the air. It's just
So if
like
you
you
had to
said.
bet right now, like if you had to guess, I mean, it seems like they're gonna be more likely to go pay if they can somehow get
That's
the
what
DVD over the line.
that's what I hope. That is not, and that's what the right will claim, that is not in the spirit of the election results.
Mhm.
Because if you add them all up, it's definitely right of center what the Netherlands voted. So Netherlands are a conservative country, definitely right leaning, definitely afraid of immigrants. They like simple solutions. It's like, it's the same all over the world, of course. So, and that's what VVD will claim. They will claim together with Ja 21 that, the Dutch want to go right, so you cannot go left. That's their argument.
Yeah, because I guess if you add them even though the PVV, the Geert Wilders party did very poorly, lost 11 seats or so,
Hmm.
if you add up the right-wing parties, they only lost 1.
Yeah,
They went from, I think, 41 to 40. So, in fact, it's very true what you say that, the sentiment overall leans in a rightward rather than leftward direction.
let's put it this way: if the Geert Wilders PVV had proven that they were capable of governing, and that means that they have capable people, the ability to give and take and negotiate and win people over for their views, then government would have been a no-brainer. But what they really showed is that, they had 37 seats in parliament, and maybe 5 of them were career politicians.
Right.
Truly, there were people.
Bunch of amateurs.
Oh, but the amateur were not only members of parliament, but the amateurs were also ministers, so there were people in charge of immigration. They were in charge of, uh, what did they have? They had, huisvesting, so, uh,
Housing,
landbouw and, so
agriculture.
yeah, agriculture. So they had a couple of, big ministries, and they really could make no change. But they did not solve any problems whatsoever in the last year and a half. So
Well,
that's this.
like as a Dutch citizen as I am, as somebody that lived in Holland for, a solid 10 years of my life, I know the country, very well. I read Dutch newspapers every single day. I read novels in Dutch and it's still very, very close to me. But although I have not lived there for 30 years now, um, it is so depressing. Well, basically, I left at the right time, and that's how it feels, I mean, I almost like, when I see election results like that, I almost don't recognize the place because, what got me into Holland at the beginning was, a lot of the political stuff, and it was like historically, if you look at the history of Holland, and you have to obviously occupied by the Nazis. I mean, we can go much further back. The first country, one of the very first things I ever learned about Holland that turned me on to the place was the verzouwing, as it's called, this agreement in society that all the different points of view need to be taken into account. And the first country where the Catholics and the Protestants got along
Yeah.
and signed agreements and said it's way better to have free trade and to be peaceful with each other than to try to kill each other all the
Oh,
time.
this has completely disappeared because,
Yeah,
like you
it's
said,
shocking to me,
the verzuiling, people very much voted for, like basic life philosophy, be it religion or pro labor or pro entrepreneurship, or, that's what you stuck with. And it really didn't matter what the voting was. But that has almost completely disappeared. So people are now very much voting not for what they have been brought up with, but sort of like the topic of the day. And
Right,
if the
right,
topic of the day is, let's say, immigration, then the votes go to the party who owns that topic, which used to
right,
be PVV last
right,
time. So the party who now owns housing, who sort of claims that, or who owns decency and proper government, they will go up. Not because, because if you ask people in the street, what would your position be on housing or on agriculture, then they will find it very difficult to say something concrete. They will say, like, solve all the problems so my children can buy a house, or solve all the problems so that the farmers can still have a decent living, but we also want to have nature. It's like, so it's basically who claims a certain subject, and emotionally owns that, and that's what people will go for.
Well, I think it's also good just to remind viewers that Holland isn't, I live now in one of the biggest countries in the world by land mass with the smallest ratio of people to land in the world, right? Australia, the world's biggest island. And, the contrast could not be more, you know, dream in terms of a Western, well-developed, wealthy country. Holland, what is the population now? 17 million or so? 16, 17 in that
No,
range?
almost 18 or
Almost
maybe
18 already.
it's over 18. Yeah, yeah.
Geez, well, it was
We're
always
full. We're full, Scott. We're
There was
full.
always 14 million when I lived there, and it already felt really
Well,
crowded.
I think we have been full, people claim, with everything over 12 million. And of course, as as a
Yeah,
citizen.
maybe even remember that you regained a lot of land from the ocean, so you made new land, famous for it. But I think also just, from the post-war period all the way until solidly into the 80s and 90s, there was a really strong social democratic bias. Even if sometimes the Christian Democrats were in power, they often were. The prime minister was from the CDA. You very often had Labor Party governments, P van de A, Party of
Yeah,
the Workers. They were very often in power, but particularly at a legislative level, in terms of international law, in terms of international relations, in terms of hosting international organizations, which it still does. The International Criminal Court is there, the International Court of Justice is there, the chemical weapons body is there. There's countless others that are based in The Hague. I mean, most famous country in the world for this stuff. I mean, international law began, in fact, in Holland, really, all the way back in Hugo de Groot's times. But it had this basis of social justice, progressivism at its heart. And the social welfare system reflected this. I mean, and the amount of social housing as a percentage of overall housing stock in the country was exceptionally high. It's one of the highest in the world always. I think it even still is in certain ways. There were programs in the 70s in particular when it was probably at its peak progressive, mid 70s, 78, where federal national government would pay artists to produce art 5 times a
yeah,
year, and that would be their income, and they would always try everything. That's what I loved about Holland. I mean, every other country was saying, "We're never going to tolerate drugs or legalize drugs." Holland would do it. We were never going to no one will legalize prostitution. Well, let's just give it a try. It might actually work. Oh, yes, they tried it. And euthanasia. Let's be
but
the first to do it.
look at the global changes in the last 20 years. One, climate change, huge. War in Europe and around
Huge.
Europe. Another big one. Social media and opinion influencing through, let's say, non-traditional means. Add those up. It's all over the place. People are afraid. People don't like the consequences that climate management brings with it. There are a ton of things that you cannot do anymore, and those things are exactly the things that they like to do, like driving very fast in cars and going on
Mhm.
vacation to Spain. So it's difficult, and it's always the elite that, of course, points out the dangers of climate change. Which there's another schism in society. 20
Even
20
speaking from one of the countries that is most at risk in the world is the country in which you're sitting now in terms of climate change. I mean, Holland's physical existence is no longer assured.
No, but we the Dutch do have, I don't know, 500 years of experience in water management. So
I
they
know.
and of course it's tiny. So to protect our coast with, like, I don't know, higher dikes or protection mechanisms, it is actually doable. It's not like we have the whole, United States coast or the Indonesian coast to
It's
protect.
more doable. I hope
It's manageable. It's manageable. So
I don't know over time, but I think those are not the pressing issues that people are basing their votes on.
no,
The
no.
interesting thing, I think I'm gonna do a project on this. Very rarely are the problems within the housing sector in countries linked to rising authoritarianism. But in fact, I think you can make a pretty convincing case in a number of countries, including Holland, that making housing increasingly unaffordable to average people will inevitably yield the growth in extreme right ideologies
Yeah.
because it makes a very easy subject to use as a way of actively blaming the other. right? Whereas in fact, Holland should have the most affordable housing of any country in Europe, just about, given its historical record of deep state involvement in constructing housing and in
But
owning
but
housing.
but look at how things look from, let's say, the simple majority. One is, yes, there's a housing shortage and everything gets more expensive and there's less affordable rental places. Okay, so this is one. So who is to blame? That's very easy. Number one, those idiots who talk about climate change all the time and who have carbon dioxide laws that make sure that you cannot do that. Okay, so it's the evil woke Greens in Brussels. That's blame number one. Blame number two is, of course, the filthy rich, because they give their children a ton of money so they can afford those houses. And of course, third is the tsunami of immigrants
Right.
coming over our country, completely overrated. But so it's very simple. Housing is something people feel, and these three factors are to blame. So very easy. So that's
Well, I think also that's totally true. And I think in addition to that, just going back to like what turned me on to Holland in the first place, I remember reading a study like from 1980 or something. It was about global attitudes towards materialism, And I got so overjoyed when I saw that Holland was the least materialistic of all
yeah,
countries measured, right?
no
And
longer
and
there.
and when I lived there, I was basically living, at or near the poverty line, essentially. I didn't care. I loved it, but, um, but but it didn't feel that way. It did not feel being at poor at all, and I wasn't getting state benefits or anything like that. But it was just that, nobody I knew had a car.
But
Most
that's
people didn't even
interesting.
have washing machines. They
Yeah,
didn't
but
have
you
this.
make a very good point, because poverty today is no longer the poverty of 50 years ago.
Yeah,
50 years ago, there were a lot of people. There's also the statistics that see that the wealth gap is actually getting smaller, but people don't feel like that because,
really?
of
In
course,
Holland, it's getting smaller, the wealth gap?
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's at 50. If you compare to 50 years ago, 50 years ago, you were lucky if you had a car and were able to go to southern France to the campsite
Yeah, that
on
was rare.
vacation,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
almost no one took a plane somewhere.
Flight. Well, most
Yeah.
people went to holiday inside Holland even,
Oh yeah, of course. And right now, people think like, I'm entitled to go on a couple of foreign vacations
Yeah,
because it's possible and everybody else is doing it. People, in spite of the fact that they are really a lot richer and the gap between them and the people who really have a ton of money to spend is getting smaller, it still doesn't feel like that.
right, right.
People have more to protect, against the people who are now lower on the ladder than they were, like immigrants who really have absolutely nothing, or labor immigrants who have to, sweat under horrible circumstances and doing the stinky jobs that no one else wants to do. So they have a stronger desire to protect what they have. And then there's a new underclass that they don't belong to. So it's nice.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's basically it. So people are definitely better off than they were 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. But that didn't make them want to share more and be happy. But it got them more protective about what they had and kicking down the people who were threatening.
Right. Do you think, I mean, uh, how do you think things have gone in terms of, societal happiness levels? Because, they always do these measurements and,
It's
Finland
high. It's
Finland
high.
it
If
is
if
pretty
you,
high. Like, Holland was in top 10, I think, right?
it's
Yeah,
like they always ask two questions: how are things with you and your family? 8 out of 10, everybody happy. How
right.
are things in the country? Horrible, terrible, no housing, immigrants all over the place. We're going down, we're going to pieces. But it's very interesting. If you ask it
That's
personally,
super interesting.
the super majority is very content.
I think that's a global phenomenon, actually. In fact, you have this disconnect between the outside and your own personal reality. I mean, like everywhere else, in the Western world, there's also this epidemic of loneliness happening everywhere, which is also just such another bizarre thing to add to the list of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
way society is de-evolving in many respects. I mean, you have more possibilities of knowing people and being with people than ever before, and yet whatever the percentage is, 20-30% of the population considers themselves lonely and maybe one friend, maybe zero. I mean, that's just tragic, you
yeah,
know?
yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, I hope old Holland can, you know, very often when you have a society that was once okay and then it got wealthy, you have this conservative trend. But then after a while, they kind of realize, well, that's actually not bringing us what we really wanted. And then they go back to the kind of let's help everybody out. And, the other issue, of course, for Holland, very famously at the international level, is used to be always one of the greatest development donor countries of all.
I,
Always in the top 2 or 3. And I remember, this is such a great thing also when I first started going to Holland in the early 1980s. Gast on tafel. Remember Gast on tafel? The guest at the table. This aid group, which still exists, Novib, developing world agency, had these little houses that they would give to people to put on their dinner table, and then when you got to the table you would put in a guilder and you would save up all that money and then you'd give it to Novib, or pay for food aid to Africa or whatever. And that was such a great instance of solidarity, like it was such a part of everything.
let me tell you one of the maybe blunders of Geert Wilders in the final debates. I don't know whether you've read about it, but they always list, the things that they didn't really do very well. So what Geert Wilders said, I believe it was day before yesterday. Yesterday, he wanted all these things, and so people asked him, "How are you going to pay for them?" And he said, "Well, we'll put a full stop on foreign aid." And then the famous quote is, and you can find it on YouTube undoubtedly. He said, "That means that the African people may be a little more hungry, but at least we won't be." I swear to God. People were like, "What did you just say?" Because, traditionally, of course, this is absolutely no-go area. But he just said, "We're not going to give away to the very poor because we need the money ourselves." And he had no
Has
problem
the
with that.
percentage of aid has gone down in Holland, hasn't it, in recent years?
It's, the right-wing parties don't want to spend one single euro unless they benefit somehow. It's very transactional.
Do you happen to know what the percentage is nowadays? Okay, because the standard UN level is that you're shooting for is 0.7%, right, of GDP, and I think
Mhm.
there were only 4 countries above that in the last measurement, and I don't think Holland was there. Norway was there, and Sweden was there, and a couple others. Not good old Holland. So, which are you looking that up right now?
Yeah, 0.66% in 2023.
Well, close to
Yeah,
point 0.7. Yeah, that is
yeah,
close.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's another thing too that I'm just reminded of my time in Holland. There was, you know, coming from the United States as a kid, you would watch, when I started watching politics there and they'd announce a new law that was adopted in Washington, and it didn't matter who was in power. Almost every time I'd be going, oh my God, I can't believe they did that. That is so absolutely heinous. And then I get to Holland and I'm following the news really closely in the politics. Every single decision by the national government, didn't matter who was in power, was like, "I can't believe they did that. That is so awesome." It's like expanding the rights of widows and,
Yeah.
increasing social welfare payments, or we're gonna build 20,000 more houses next year. Everything was, like, always positive and growing and looking for the future, and, like, never again the world's, Second World War reality. We will never forget that, and we will always build a more and, better progressive nation, and seems like those days are a little bit behind us, I'm
Yeah.
afraid.
Yeah. But, it's maybe that's the conclusion. There it was definitely a movement towards stability and normalcy and decency. So, and that's pretty good because in the past, whatever you thought of, specific individual measures government took, at least they were able to govern a country in a decent fashion, considering the rights and the desires of the different people in the nation. So hopefully we'll get a stable, normal, governing government. That would be
Well, yeah,
pretty
that's
that
true.
would be pretty good already.
But it's also really important, I think, to point out that in a world of declining democracy and ascending autocracy, nobody's questioning the systematic nature of the fair voting system that took place in Holland. Everybody who wanted to vote could vote quickly and freely and easily. There's a total confidence by society at large in the system of democracy that exists at all levels, local level, district, gemeente level, and regional and national. And that's really important. And there's a lot of lessons that I think can be learned from Holland in that regard. Not so much the policies, but the simple fact that campaigns are so incredibly short compared to many other countries, especially
Yeah.
the United States. 4 weeks, 6 weeks max. And I don't know how the situation is now, but certainly when I lived there, most political campaigns were publicly financed. Private money was almost entirely, if not entirely, absent from the political process.
Well, in absolute measures, that still is the case. I think that the biggest overall contribution to a political party, maybe 2 million euro, something like that. So it's very tiny, very tiny. And it, of course, has to all be made public. And there is a cap on what you can give. And so it's very difficult to give away large sums of money
And even,
to
I don't know.
influence the direction.
Right, and, even the way the campaign posters are put together in Holland compared to other countries. I mean, they'll have a billboard, but it'll have, like, 20 different political parties' posters on the billboard, very neatly organized. Nobody's crossing stuff out, nobody's putting graffiti. They're totally boring, but that's the way politics should be. I say that to everybody. Politics should be extremely boring, so boring that you never watch it. It should be a largely technocratic affair, totally subject to the will of the people, but it should really be technocratic experts who you never hear about doing the job behind the scenes and not charisma should be removed from politics if we care about democracy because charisma always results in what, you know?
The big thing is the definition of democracy itself, of course, because some people interpret that as majority rules. So when you believe you're the majority, that means you get to say everything. And that's not what democracy is. Democracy
That's
is
not at all what it is.
people show their opinion and the government, resulting government, is supposed to respect and reflect that opinion. So it's always negotiating, it's always coalition. There's always a huge gray area between progressive and conservative. And, that's what you have to deal with if you're a country.
Which is a great system. I mean, to have so many. I mean, it can be problematic. I mean, that's why the Germans learned their lessons and have proportional representation because they had so many parties in previous parliaments. But, compared to two-party states like the United States and many others,
That's terrible.
I
That's a
mean, that's
terrible,
really I mean,
terrible
you
system.
can't have a us or them kind of reality in politics. It should be a reflection of the very widespread views that exist in society. And no matter who you are in Holland, one of those parties is going to be really close to what you believe in.
Yeah.
You don't have to put all your eggs in the labor basket or all your eggs in the conservative basket. You can choose this little teeny thing. You love animals, so you vote for the animal party, whatever it is. And I think that's a really, positive thing that should, obviously be accessible to more people, in more places. Keep us updated, Hoop, on who finally wins and who finally takes over. I guess they call it formation of a government in Holland. The last one took, wasn't it 233 days or something like that?
It was awful because they, like with the new parties, there were no traditional majorities. So everybody had to find things out. And in the end, they came up with a ridiculous formula with, that the prime minister who was not part of any party, which was an internal
That's right.
disaster, but also for foreign policy, because of course he didn't have any clout in Brussels whatsoever. So that was not
Yeah,
good.
that's right. Well, I think what
I'll keep you up to date.
your longest one was 299 days, I believe. And
Yeah, that
then
was
and then
yeah.
I just read that Belgium had one where it was 535 days
I
or
know.
something. But, I mean, it's really interesting to look at that phenomenon from the perspective of, just how much do we actually need governments? Because nobody died, nobody went hungry, everything, the system worked, the economy kept going, the banks were working fine, the stock market was probably going up. The roads were taken care of, everything was working, but there was no government.
It's not true. It's like corporations. You can do without a long-term strategy for a couple of years. You know, Nothing
Yeah, sure.
changes. You get all your operational staff doing your stuff, so you'll last a couple of years. But there is a point, and the Netherlands have definitely reached that point. You need some kind of housing vision. You need some kind of
You do.
agricultural vision because it's a lead time of years before you get into a situation that you can benefit. So if you don't do anything now to realize the situation that you believe should exist in 5 years from now, you'll be screwed 5 years from now, which is what's happening now.
Okay, last question is Holland has always been in the vanguard of support for the European Union from the very beginning when it was the European Economic Steel and Coal Community in the 90s and 50s and into into the current day. Where do things stand now in terms of Dutch relations with the vision of the EU of an ever closer union and all of that?
I would say that the pro-European parties and their, of course, D66, that was one of their main themes. CDA as well, the GroenLinks Partij van de Arbeid, VVD, they're all pro-European. So if that's the government, then that's pretty good. And all the extreme rights that we had in government in the last year, they're all kicked out. So I would say it's definitely pro-European.
Right. Sounds good. If pro-European becomes pro-world as the next step, I'm all for it. I'm all for it all the way.
I'm afraid I won't live to see that day, but who knows?
Gotta still fight for it. Gotta still fight for it. Try to think back 30 years and predict what would have happened now, right? And there's no way we would have predicted any of this.
No.
So who knows what's to come, man? The future's so bright. You're gonna have to wear shades.
All right.
Okay,
Thanks a lot, Scott.
Hoop van der Wouden, thank you so much talking to us about the Dutch election results. We'll be back soon with the next episode of Democracy Tomorrow. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. Bye.